Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit. I'm always so happy and excited to be landing in this space because I just feel like this podcast is like a home for me in terms of the online universe. And frankly, I don't even know if people are still listening to podcasts. I have to say, like in the last few months, I don't know if it's my programming or if it's like, as in like the stuff that I put out, or if like people's relationship to online content is just changing dramatically. But I have never felt since I started this podcast that I'm screaming into the void. But I would say in the last few months, it's kind of felt like that, you know? But at the same time, like, I don't know, there's just something about this space specifically that always feels really cozy, and it feels like a space where I can just be and I can just share my thoughts and things that are moving through my life, the process I'm currently in, the work that I'm creating. So it feels really amazing, and I just want to say thank you for being here if you are listening to this. There was something else I was going to say before I launched into today's episode, and that is, oh yes, I remember. I have been taking a break from doing monthly episodes that talk about the themes and the energetic qualities of the time. And frankly, honestly, it's because I got bored of doing those. And, you know, the last time this happened was a couple years ago. I believe it was 2024. I used to do these weekly episodes, and then I decided I couldn't do it anymore. I got like kind of a little too tightly wound up in terms of my process, in terms of my own quote standards of how I'm producing it. So then I had to kind of stop because it was getting not fun for me. And maybe like about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, I think it was May, I decided I wasn't going to do one. And then in June, I didn't really do one either. And I decided not to make it a formal thing because I just was like, I'm just going to take a break. You know, I'm not going to make this like a formal break or anything like that. And it turned out to be a really good move for me because turns out the juice is back on. And in a couple days, I'll be sharing with you all the July episode, which is going to contain the themes. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on that episode. But I just want to let you guys know that you can expect that moving forward. And I think, I don't know, I really missed it. I'll say that. I really missed it. I really needed the break. I really missed it. So I'm back. Okay, so I've been really busy preparing for this course that I'm creating. You know, course is such a funny word because I feel like this offering it has a really unique format. And it's more, I've been thinking about if there's another word other than course to describe it. And I think maybe this offering is better called a guided daily ritual. So for 9 weeks, you'll be receiving daily prompts that assist you in helping helping you kind of look at your relationship with creativity and then start to actually make art. Start to actually engage in your creative practice. And this course is called Creative Exorcism. It's been in the works for some time, and I am just so excited for this course to start. I really made it for mystics, for intuitives, for sensitives who have been on the healing path for some time, who have always wanted to make art, maybe since they were very little, and they haven't found their flow in their art making practice. And I'm really thinking about a very specific kind of person when I was creating this offering. In my mind, the perfect person for this offering is someone who has a really deep relationship with their spiritual practice. Maybe it's a morning pages practice, maybe it's their meditation practice, but they won't skip their spiritual practice, right? They have that commitment, they have that discipline, and they just keep at it. And yet, when it comes to making their art, expressing themselves creatively, they really struggle with it. They either maybe couldn't stick with an artistic practice long enough, right? To really see their skills improving, to really get to a point of completing something that they're really proud of. I'm thinking about maybe someone who wants to paint and who wants to have a painting that they can hang in their living room, but somehow, they've bought the paint, they've bought maybe the watercolors, and still they haven't gotten around to doing it. That's one kind of person. Another kind of person could be you've made stuff, maybe you've even made a lot of stuff, maybe you have a robust artistic practice, but somehow you really struggle to claim that identity for yourself. That there's a part of you that feels like you don't get to be an artist. Other people get to be an artist, other people get to claim that title, but somehow you don't. And you can't seem to figure out why. And that's causing some distortion in terms of how you then share your work with people out there. Because if you struggle saying to people, I'm an artist, I'm really passionate about making music, it's going to be harder for you to share your music with people, you know? And then the third type of person would be the person who's like me, has always been a creative their entire life, but really has a lot of creative trauma in their psyche, in their body. And maybe a few years ago, you got off the bandwagon because you experienced some major disappointment. Something didn't go well in the project that you have been pouring all of your energy, your resources, your thoughts into. Maybe a collaboration went sour, or somebody you respected said something really mean about your work, and then you stopped. And then you got into kind of a healing journey. Maybe that's simply through pausing, or maybe you got into things like astrology, things like tarot, and then now you kind of want to bring this new version of you who has done all this healing work into your creative practice, but you don't quite know how to do that. That somehow you realize that all the ways that you've been orienting to your artistic practice in the past have been driven by all these energies that now you don't really want to be driven by. Maybe you used to make your art because you were really angry at the world. Or maybe you used to make your art because you were trying to prove yourself. I'm raising my hand here. Maybe you wanted to make your art because you wanted external validation, and now you know better. And then you're like, well, how do I make art from this place where I'm maybe not no longer raging at the world. I'm no longer trying to prove myself. Um I'm no longer feeling bad or trying to get external validation all the time. What's the point of making art now? How do I make art as this new version of myself? So this offering is really for you if any of that feels like you. And I also wanted to share kind of a little bit more about why I care about this offering. The tagline for this podcast is Astrology, Archetypes, and Art Making. When I first started healing the spirit, and maybe even before that, when I first started my healing practice publicly, I really wanted to create a connection between astrology, other modalities that are archetypally based, like tarot, which I deeply love and have a really intimate relationship with, and art making. And I really believe there's something about the connection between these things that are profound, that are really speaking to what I'm here to do on a deeper level. And it took me a number of years to figure out how the art making piece fit together into all of the things. And this is my conclusion at this time, which is that art making and creative practice is a microcosm to reality creation. Let me explain what I mean by that. When you are creating art, essentially what you're doing is you're manifesting. There is a frequency that you're connecting to, and there is an unseen source of inspiration that you are in communication with that you would like to bring down into material form. That's literally what a creative practice or an art practice is. You have this vision, you have a feeling, you have a sense or even a curiosity, and you would like to translate that into something that you can touch, something that you can hold, something you can feel existing in a material plane. And what I've found over time through my own experimentation and also observing the lives of my clients is that art making, whatever your format of art making is, right? Art making and creative practice, maybe writing a novel, maybe writing songs, maybe creating paintings, maybe weaving, crochet, making clothes. Again, the modality, the creative modality doesn't matter. But the very act of committing to or putting yourself through the process of listening to inspiration and then letting that move through you and become something that you can share with people, or at least that you can tangibly see, is essentially, if you are conscious about the process and about what's happening within you as you're doing that, it becomes a crash course in manifestation. In other words, if you've been struggling to manifest the kinds of relationships that you want, the kind of job that you want to have, the kinds of life that you want to live, conscious art making can really show you where you're getting tripped up. It can show you all your patterns. It can show you your impatience. It can show you your relationship with frustration, your fear of failure. It can show you what you believe on a less than conscious level that you otherwise wouldn't be able to really connect with. For example, this podcast is one of my art practices, right? I really consider this podcast as an artistic expression for me. And there are weeks where, just to be honest with you guys, I am really caught up in my own perfectionism. And sometimes it's not just weeks, they really last for a while. And you can probably even hear it in my voice. I don't know. If you are perceptive enough, you probably would be able to detect that. And when we bring when we bring awareness into our art making practice and we really see these patterns happening, we can start to, it becomes a mirror, right? It becomes a mirror. And if we do it regularly enough, if we make our art, if we engage in that creative practice regularly enough, it then helps us see that pattern and it helps us transmute that energy and then open up a new portal in our reality. right? So essentially, you end up doing two things at the same time. You end up making some art, something that you can share with others, something that can be beneficial and you can enjoy with other people. And you also get to transmute that energy. You get to open up a new portal in your reality. And I think this is just so incredible, right? And in some ways, some aspects of that have always been operative in my mystical practice. When I see clients, when I teach classes, and I share mystical tools with my students, there's some level of that gets to happen, right? Meaning, whatever it is that I'm working through, I get to share it with other people. But what I see is, especially for a lot of my students who are very committed and devoted to their spiritual practice, and they do it privately, sometimes that doesn't quite show you where you're really getting tripped up in your real life. Because there is a quality about our spiritual practice that can be so internally directed. You know, like when you're journaling, for example, you really just allowing yourself to look at your inner material, right? And then, for example, if you engage in the morning practice or the morning pages as prescribed by Julia Cameron, you would never look at your morning pages entries ever again, really. You leave it behind. But there's something about conscious art making that is about returning to the same thing over and over again, right? That then forces you to really look at what is it that I'm creating and why did it turn out this way? Not in a critical way, not in a way where you're berating yourself, but through the act of walking within that slightly narrow path of making or committing to one artistic practice, one creative practice, you start to see your own patterns very clearly if you want to see them, right? So today's topic is working with feeling disempowered about claiming the identity of an artist or feeling disempowered about doing creative work. So, what that looks like is maybe you find yourself under the level of your conscious mind, telling yourself, I can't possibly call myself an artist, or I can't possibly make my art. I don't have the discipline, or I don't have the resources. I don't have time. This is a huge one that I keep hearing from people, that I have all these responsibilities. I don't have time. And all of these, to me, actually really stem from some of the same beliefs, some of the same internal patterns. They look different. Somebody who resists calling themselves an artist looks different than someone who is feeling like they can't show up to their creative practice, right? Like that actually, in terms of the phenomena itself, those two phenomena are actually very different, and probably will require slightly different solutions in order to unravel. But even though they look very different, deep down, there are some patterns that I keep seeing over and over again in my own life, in my practice, 30 plus years being a creative, as well as with my clients. So the first place I want to share with you guys the three places that I would look to, right? So the first place I would look, and by the way, we are doing all of this within creative exorcism. So if this exploration sounds interesting to you, if it feels like, oh yeah, this is really the kind of stuff that I want to be doing, I want to be looking at, then I think this offering is really going to speak to you and it's going to be very useful for you. The first place I would look is, what is your definition of creativity and what's your definition of art? And the reason why we stop and think about our definition of art and really look at our definition of creativity is because they will show us what are some of the standards you place on yourself in order to call yourself an artist. So let me give an example. I studied classical piano and I had been playing the piano since I was 7. And once I started getting serious about playing the piano, this was maybe around age, say, 14, I, in hindsight, realized that I had this story. I started putting these goalposts for myself that in order to be a legitimate pianist, I had to first get into a music conservatory. So I worked very hard. I got really incredible teachers in Jakarta back when I was growing up in order for me to get my playing to a level where I can be admitted to a music conservatory. And then I did get into Manhattan School of Music here in New York, which was a great conservatory. And then I placed a new standard for myself where I told myself in order for me to be legitimate and so I can call myself a pianist, I have to be able to play certain pieces. And then once I was able to play those pieces, I told myself I had to achieve certain grades in the final exam. I had to get a certain amount of scholarship. I had to be able to get into certain schools. At that time, it was Juilliard, where I was like, I had to get into that school to prove myself that I can do this, And um, I didn't really think it was about external validation. But in hindsight, I think that was always there too, and the last kind of hurdle I placed on myself before all of these hurdle settings eventually broke me and broke my desire to even want to play the piano was I told myself I had to get into Carnegie Hall. And based on my trajectory at that moment and how I felt about my own playing, I just kind of decided that I would never get there. So then I quit, you know? So my example is somewhat extreme because I did take this really far, this was between the ages of 14 to maybe 22. So it was like 8 to 9 years of putting myself through this, but in my case, I ended up kind of seeing most of all of that, right? Most of the different standards I put myself through. And eventually, what I can tell you is that none of that was actually satisfying to me. And the reason why it wasn't satisfying was because I had never really seriously stopped and asked myself, is this what I really wanted? Is this definition really my own definition? Or is this something that I was told I should want? Is this something that I was told I should become in order to be a legitimate pianist? So, in your case, right, perhaps if you are someone who's interested in visual art, maybe you never allowed yourself to take painting classes because you feel like a visual artist needs to have an exhibit or a visual artist needs a studio and you don't have time or energy or resources to be able to create that studio. So you just don't do it, right? So the work really begins here with investigating how much of these definitions are yours. In my experience, most of the definition that people have are not theirs. They're just really not. Most of the time, people are shocked actually when I ask them in sessions, what's your definition of being an artist? What do you mean when you say you want to be a creative person? And they kind of went blank because they never thought about that. And or they would say something that they've heard that is kind of a regurgitation of something that they've heard other people saying. So this is really profound work, even though it's so foundational. And even if you've been an artist and you feel like you have your own definition, you probably will be a little surprised when you start digging because you will find stuff in there that's not yours. And if it's not yours, either you won't be motivated or it will feel like someone is breathing down your neck. And if it's yours, but somehow you can't make yourself do it for whatever reason, then what we want to do is we want to bring your energy to the present moment. A lot of the times when you have an idea that is really rooted in your own desire, in what you want, but somehow that idea doesn't have energy, doesn't immediately get you into doing the thing, doesn't inspire you, in other words, what's happening is you are either stuck in the past or a version of yourself, a version of how you see yourself in the past, or you are too worried about the future, right? So, what we want to do is we want to bring you your consciousness, your energy into the present moment. And then to continue doing that work of calling yourself back to present time until the next smallest step begins to emerge. Usually, people struggle a little bit with the stage because the next step can seem so small. But very often, that is precisely what's needed to move them forward. Taking that super small step gives you an awareness of what's possible, even if it's happening below the conscious level. And you start moving towards a specific direction, and which is really, really profound, because what you're doing is you are leaving the prison of defeating yourself before you even make the move, right? Having the wrong definition, and what I mean by the wrong definition is definitions that are really not actually personally meaningful to you, that doesn't mean something or doesn't really resonate with you on a being level. Having the wrong definition of being an artist and being a creative is like a snake eating its own tail. Because if you continue to operate from that definition, if you don't achieve what you want to achieve, you'll be blaming yourself. And if you do, you will still feel empty because that's not yours. And then you will end up blaming yourself again. So before we unravel this, before we clear out those definitions that aren't yours, doing creative work can either feel really exhausting to the point where you don't want to do it anymore, which is really not the point, right? Because the point of doing creative work, if you are a creative person, is because you really want to. You know, your soul is craving for it, right? Your spirit is moving you towards it. You can't help but be drawn to doing creative work. You can't help but being drawn to art. And yet, if you're not doing it, something is amiss in your definition, usually. So that's the first place. The second place I would look to is I would look at where are your pedestals. So this is really cool because in a lot of whenever we're talking about creativity, right, in the kind of self-development world that also likes to talk about creativity, in that specific corner, we're used to tending to the inner critic. But what I've found most often is that the inner fangirl, the inner fanboy, the inner fan they, whatever the non-binary version of that is, often has a stronger grip on us because we are less conscious of the ways that the inner stan, right, the inner fan is holding us back from doing what we truly want. When you put something on a pedestal, you're actually creating distance between yourself and the thing. On some subconscious level, what you're saying is, I can't possibly do that. Right? If you doom scroll on Instagram and you come across an actor or an actress who is really, really stunning looking, probably your first thought is, wow, they're so stunning. I'm not like that. You know, so what you're doing is really creating that gap between who you are and your dreams and your passion, right? In my own life, it was wild to me looking back that I did not take singing lessons until I was 29 because as a child, I was always obsessed with singers. Whenever I saw someone singing on stage, even if they're not famous, even if they're singing at church or they're singing at school, I would be like a moth to a flame. Like I would be like, oh my gosh, this person is so cool. Like, and that energy is so interesting because we don't look at what's underneath that energy, right? Because that energy feels really good. It feels really good to fangirl over people. I am a forever fangirl. And I'm not saying that you need to quit it. Um, there are still a bunch of things in my life that I'm like fangirling super hard over. But it only really becomes a quote issue if it creates this gap where you then never even crossed your mind to bridge the gap you have in the skill between where you currently are and the skill level you want to get to, right? Because many of us don't just want to have a creative practice. We want to create something that's actually pleasing for us. We want to make music that sounds beautiful. We want to be able to act at a local play and feel this ecstatic experience of being witnessed in our craft by an audience. We want to create a painting that we can show our friends, or maybe we can even sell to people on the internet, right? Ultimately, many of us have those creative ambitions, but the reality is you cannot achieve those creative ambitions if you don't put in the work, right? And I am very mindful of qualifying the work itself, right? I don't want to say that the work has to be hard or it has to take a certain number of years because all of that is just a story, right? The process is the process. For some people, it'll take a long time. For some people, it'll not take a long time. But I think, especially as people who are conscious, people who are on our spiritual path, people who are watching our own process, we can safely say that we know how to be with the process because we have all these tools, right? We have, our morning pages, our meditation tools, our magic, our tarot cards to help us help encourage ourselves through the process when the process doesn't feel that great. So that's not usually what the problem is. The problem is actually committing to wanting to bridge that gap, right? And usually we don't even start. We don't even get ourselves a head start, permission to get into doing the thing because we are so busy. Our energy goes into fangirling. You know, um, I noticed this with painting for myself as well currently because I would go to museums. I love art. Like I would go to MoMA here in New York or the Met, and you can leave me there for basically the entire day. I'm happy to just sit there and like fawn over the paintings. And that's really great. But also, if all that fawning, right, means that I spend all my time just kind of getting lost in the paintings when actually maybe deep down there is a desire for me to paint, I'm going to hit a point where my fangirling is not going to fill the hole that that is there. Because the only thing that can actually fill that hunger is to make art. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going on here, right? Because I think it's helpful for many of us to look at the mechanism that's happening underneath this. The first one is what I call fantasy culture. What I mean by that is we put artists on a pedestal because we care so much about results and notoriety. We care so much about being famous as a culture. We care so much about masterpieces. And we don't value process. People don't get Grammy for like a Grammy award for being in their process and honoring their process. And that is not necessarily a criticism about the culture. To me, that's just a reflection of what the culture values, right? So when it comes to artists or people who have artistic inclinations, very likely, if you don't have parents or caretakers who are artists themselves, they don't really know the importance of honoring that process. Not because they don't love you, but because they just don't know. And maybe they never had that inclinations themselves, or they shut down that inclinations for themselves, right? In any case, what you need as an artist is someone who can help you remember that the process is so important. For you as an artist, the process is everything, because the more you can have a healthy relationship, a really grounded, personal, authentic, true relationship with your own process, the more you will become essentially unshakable as an artist. Because failures and successes, they're really just stops on the journey. Every artist will tell you this. Look at, for example, the career of Elizabeth Gilbert. Many years ago, she created um, Eat, Pray, Love, right, which became a huge bestseller. And then since then, she hasn't had the same level of commercial success, maybe with Big Magic, which is her book on creativity. I think that also had a lot of traction. But if you look at Liz Gilbert, she's someone who does not stop creating. In her novels, her success is not like, this upward trajectory, right? It's kind of like boom, 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 boom. That's like all over the map. Some things are very successful, some other things didn't get a lot of traction from people. But it doesn't really matter, because my perception of her and what she shared in Big Magic is that she has such an unshakable relationship with the process of writing itself. And she's actually someone who's quite militaristic with the process, and you don't have to be like that. That's the other thing too. You don't have to be one of those people who sit there every morning and write 5,000 words. I mean, you can, but you don't have to. But I do believe that some level of consistency, even if your definition of consistency is, I'm going to make art when I want to, when I am driven to, when there's the impulse to. Even if you do that, that will be infinitely better than if you don't, and you don't let yourself make stuff, you know? So, going back to the fantasy culture, I feel like because of this fantasy culture, because of this orientation towards the end product, most people are not sufficiently educated about the various aspects of the artistic process. Most people don't understand the level of how much artists need to sit in front of the empty page to do their work. I once went to this um, exhibit in a museum in Japan. I believe it was Tokyo, but I can't fully remember. And there was this exhibition that was about this calligraphy master. And there was a video there. And it really, really struck me because his process was he would sit in front of an empty page and he would do nothing for a very long time. And then he was interviewed and he said, what I did there was I was stilling myself. I was allowing myself to come to a point of absolute stillness within myself. And then when I am totally still, I can finally feel when the impulse comes through me. The impulse to pick up the brush and then finally create the calligraphy, painting, drawing that he was creating. And it was striking When I saw that video, it was like, whoa, you know? And I think this really gets to the heart of the truth of the creative process. The creative process is really not about the end results. Creativity itself is not about the results. It's about having the humility to return to that empty page over and over again. That's what makes an artist. What makes an artist is not how many masterpieces they've created. It's not how much money are they making. It's not do other people know them. No. What actually makes a true artist is the ability to sit in front of an empty page. And that is a skill you can cultivate. And related to that, I would also say that consumer culture plays a huge role because consumer culture teaches us not to appreciate the work and the inner transformation required to do the work because the point is to essentially fatten yourself up, right? Consumer culture says make so much money so that you can just buy things instead of being involved in the process, instead of educating yourself about the process, right? So then we have this entire culture where so many of us grossly underestimate how much time true artistry takes because we're taught to produce, right? We're either taught to produce or we're taught to consume. We're not taught to actually create. To me, production and true creation are very different. They are worlds apart because the posture that we arrive at in order to actually create from the deeper parts of us is is it's like a state. It's like meditating. You don't get to that state just by not meditating, right? Like you have to practice meditating in order to be able to reach that level of no mind, in order to reach that level of flow. There's something vulnerable about deciding to participate. There's something vulnerable about moving from just consuming, because when you're just consuming, you can very easily criticize, right? You can say, I don't like this. This, no, right? But when you're involved in the creative process, when you're involved in making it yourself, you develop such an appreciation of how much work it takes to get to that point. It's very vulnerable to create. The third place I would look at, and I think my last point really nicely dovetails into this, is look at our definition of work. Many people are allergic to working because we live in a culture, again, that is overworked. We are burned out. Work has become oppressive. Work has become the thing we need to do to survive rather than an extension and an expression of who we are. We end up having this really toxic and codependent relationship with work because work culture has become so driven by fear. Essentially, so much of the modern work culture is founded upon this idea, this belief that if you don't work or you don't work the right way, you don't work the right jobs, you will die. And we've created an entire infrastructure based on this belief. Recently, I was listening to Bashar, who was channeled by Daryl Anka. And Bashar said something along the lines of, there's no such thing as a lack of trust. There's only belief in lack. I'm going to repeat that once again because I think this is so important. Bashar said, there's no such thing as lack of trust. There's only belief in lack. We've built an entire culture entirely driven by this fear of lack, which is really a belief, right? Because the universe actually works based on resonance. In other words, when we choose to train ourselves to see abundance, we begin to see abundance in all its forms. And we will see that abundance that is in the form of money, in the form of status, in the form of power, in terms of kind of relative power, right? All of that is just, there's just more cult around these currencies, right? There's more energy that people have consciously and subconsciously poured into these currencies. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other life giving forms of currency that you can access in abundance, right? You know, there's something that Bashar said that really struck me as well. He said something about how we are so beloved by life beyond our comprehension to the point where we're allowed to believe in this idea that life will not take care of us. Let that sink in for a second. We are so beloved by life that we are given the free will to believe that life will not take care of us, which is completely untrue. And because the extent of our free will that's given to us is so infinitely generous, we're allowed to make that mistake over and over and over again. Some people never get out of that belief for their entire life. And that's not a problem because the soul is eternal and there's going to be the next chance to try again, learn that lesson again, right? That belief that we won't be cared for is just completely untrue. Only when we recognize that can we finally step out of this idea that work has to be suffering. Because this restrictive, life-sucking definition of work is something that also gets reflected, that infiltrates our creative work. Because creative work is work. But if we begin to turn towards a relationship to work that is actually regenerative, we'll find that there's something really profound about work. The right kind of work will refresh you. The right kind of work is here to help you transmute from feeling dull and uninspired to deeply grateful that you've been given life. The right kind of work energizes you even as it also demands of you, right? It is still work. But there's nothing more incredible than seeing our life force transferred out of our body into something that we can touch, into something we can look at, into something where we can say, wow, I really created that. So here are the three things that I would look at if you are someone who feels like making art is difficult, or you're really resisting your calling, your inner calling as an artist. And I hope that helps. If this exploration sounds exciting to you, if you want to go deeper, join Creative Exorcism. Early bird ends tonight, which is Monday, June 29th. And then the journey officially begins next Monday, July 6th. It's an independent study program with daily audio, daily written prompts, and I have designed it so that it can be exciting and it can really meet you wherever you're at. And you'll feel like I'm guiding you every step of the way, which is, I think, really cool. This is the kind of creative healing opportunity, creative healing work that I wish I had when I was in moments of feeling my own creative resistance. So, yeah, so much love to all of you, and I will see you very soon. Take care.